The sun had barely risen when I received the letter that would change everything. It was the fourth notice from our Homeowners Association, HOA, that month, but this one was different. The others had been annoying but manageable. This one was a forceful ultimatum. My property was being targeted for violation after violation, each one more absurd than the last. The HOA president, Karen, had already made it clear that she didn't like how I kept my lawn a little wild. She hated the small vegetable garden I'd been growing in my backyard. That's the thing with Karen. She didn't just want to keep up community standards. She wanted to control everything. But when the HOA demanded I sell my house because my garden wasn't up to par, that was the last straw. I was livid, but I knew I couldn't just sit back and take it. I'd built my life here. The house had been in my family for generations. My kids had grown up here, and we'd turned this neighborhood into a real home. But Karen didn't care about any of that. All she cared about was making sure everything looked perfect on the surface, even if it meant pushing out families like mine who didn't fit her narrow definition of normal. The HOA had already pushed several families out of the community over the years, using small infractions to force them to sell. I was not about to let them do the same to me. I called a lawyer and explained the situation. The lawyer was shocked, but unsurprised. The HOA's tactics were well known, but most people didn't have the resources to fight back. I was different, though. I had something they didn't expect. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, emails, and phone calls. I found out that the HOA was financially unstable. Its board members had questionable business dealings, and there were rumors of corruption. It seemed that Karen's power wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about using the HOA as a personal tool to further her own agenda. The more I dug, the more I realized that I had been living under the control of a very toxic system. But the real breakthrough came when I learned that the HOA had sold off parts of the community to developers without informing the residents. That was the key. If Karen could sell off the neighborhood to whoever had the money, then why couldn't I buy it? The thought came to me suddenly, like a bolt of lightning. Why not? Why not buy the entire community and take control? It was a risky move, but I had nothing to lose. I called a real estate agent and started looking into properties for sale. It didn't take long to find out that most of the homes in the neighborhood were underpriced. Karen had been so focused on controlling everything that she hadn't noticed the deals slipping through her fingers. Soon, I was in talks with several property owners, making offers they couldn't refuse. My lawyer and I put together a strategy to acquire as much of the community as possible. I was going to buy Karen's HOA out from under her and take back my life. Weeks later, it was happening. I owned half the neighborhood. The properties I had purchased gave me a seat at the HOA table, and I started quietly taking control. I wasn't about to throw my weight around right away, but I was gathering support. There were more residents than I thought who were fed up with Karen's constant harassment. They were waiting for someone to lead them, and I realized I was the person they had been waiting for. As the acquisition process moved forward, I began to notice a shift in the neighborhood. People were talking. They were starting to take notice of the changes happening, and Karen was getting nervous. She had no idea that I was slowly gathering the power I needed to kick her out. The moment came sooner than expected. Karen, with her typical sense of entitlement, called an emergency HOA meeting. She demanded that all new buyers be forced to adhere to the most ridiculous rules. The community was practically shaking in fear, but no one was brave enough to speak out. I showed up at the meeting, calm but determined. Karen immediately started her usual routine, pretending to be the savior of the neighborhood, touting her list of violations and threats to the property values. But this time, I had something she didn't. I had control. I stood up during the meeting, looked straight at her, and calmly declared, "I own the majority of the properties in this neighborhood now, Karen. Your reign is over. You're not in charge anymore." The shock on her face was priceless. She sputtered, trying to maintain her composure, but it was clear she had lost her grip. Karen's face turned an eerie shade of pale, and for the first time, I saw her lose control. She stammered, trying to gather her thoughts, but the room had already shifted. The residents, who had been too scared to speak up for years, were now looking at me with newfound respect. There was a palpable sense of change in the air, like a storm had just passed and the sun was starting to shine again. Karen's facade of authority was crumbling. She tried to salvage the situation by clinging to the same tired rules and regulations she had used to terrorize everyone. But it was clear to everyone in the room that her power had slipped through her fingers. I wasn't just another disgruntled homeowner anymore. I was the majority stakeholder in this community, and that gave me leverage no one had ever expected. Karen attempted to rally the remaining board members, but the support she once had was dwindling fast. Her arrogance had driven so many away, and now the residents were no longer intimidated by her. As the meeting progressed, I could see the shifting tides. Neighbors who had once been too scared to oppose her now stood tall, shaking their heads in disbelief at her blunders. I knew this moment was pivotal. It was my chance to end her reign of terror once and for all. I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me. What I was about to do wasn't just about Karen. It was about every single person in this neighborhood who had been bullied and made to feel small under her rule. In the weeks that followed, I continued to make strategic moves, meeting with residents privately and explaining the changes that were coming. The more I learned about the HOA's finances and Karen's personal dealings, the more I understood how deeply corrupt the entire system had become. I wasn't just buying property anymore. I was dismantling an empire built on control and fear. Each new acquisition was another nail in Karen's coffin. And as the remaining properties in the community shifted hands, Karen's grip on the neighborhood weakened. I wasn't just taking control of the HOA. I was giving the power back to the people who had been silenced for so long. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived when I became the majority shareholder of the HOA board. The change was inevitable. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Karen's defiance had become laughable. She showed up, as she always did, with her perfectly pressed suit and air of superiority. But now, there was no one left to back her. The board members who had once been her loyal followers had either resigned or seen the writing on the wall. The community was no longer afraid of her. The moment Karen entered the room, I could tell she realized the game was up. The smiles and nods from the other board members were now replaced with cold, indifferent stares. She was outnumbered, outclassed, and out of options. I stood up at the meeting and took control. The time had come to make it official. Karen was no longer in charge, and I wasn't going to let her run this community into the ground any longer. I announced that the board had voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president. Her face contorted with rage and disbelief, but there was nothing she could do. She tried to argue, claiming that I was violating HOA bylaws, but I calmly pointed out that I now controlled the majority of the votes. The law was on my side, and there was nothing she could do to stop me. The other residents watched in silence as Karen's world came crashing down. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one holding all the cards. The weeks that followed were some of the most intense I had ever experienced. Karen, never one to back down without a fight, launched a legal battle, hoping to regain control of the neighborhood. But this time it was different. I had everything I needed: the properties, the legal backing, and the support of the community. As Karen's case faltered, more and more residents came forward with their stories of how she had mistreated them. The once quiet neighborhood had become a battleground, but this time we were winning. Karen's arrogance had finally caught up with her, and the legal system was now working in our favor. It wasn't just about her getting kicked out of the HOA. It was about making sure she could never harm another community again. I watched as Karen's influence in the neighborhood dwindled to nothing. The homes she had once controlled were now thriving, and the residents were starting to take charge of their own lives. No one was afraid to speak out anymore. No one was afraid to stand up for what was right. With Karen out of the picture, the entire neighborhood began to transform. There was a sense of unity and cooperation that hadn't existed before, and it felt like we were building something better together. I had won, but the victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to every person who had been wronged by Karen's rule. Karen, defeated and humiliated, was forced to sell her own house. She was out of options. The community she had once ruled with an iron fist had turned on her, and she had nowhere left to turn. The day she packed up and left was the day the neighborhood truly became ours. It wasn't just about getting her out. It was about taking back what was rightfully ours. The sense of justice and relief was overwhelming. The power had shifted, and with it, a new chapter began for our neighborhood. We had fought back and won, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had been oppressed by her cruelty. With Karen gone, the transformation of the neighborhood was nothing short of remarkable. What had once been a place of tension, fear, and constant surveillance became a vibrant, united community where people supported each other. Without the looming threat of fines and ridiculous rules, residents began to breathe easier. The HOA that had once been a source of oppression was now a tool for empowerment. And I took it upon myself to lead the charge in making sure the system was fair, transparent, and focused on fostering a sense of belonging. The first thing I did was initiate a community meeting. It was time to introduce a new way of governing, one that prioritized the needs and voices of everyone, not just a few power-hungry individuals. We established new guidelines for the HOA, ones that were flexible, respectful, and most importantly, inclusive. One of the most significant changes was how we approach violations. Instead of using them as a way to punish and exclude people, we created a system focused on education and collaboration. If someone's lawn was overgrown or their fence was in disrepair, instead of sending a threatening letter or a fine, we now offered assistance, whether it was advice, resources, or even volunteer help from neighbors who wanted to give back. It wasn't about maintaining an artificial standard of perfection anymore. It was about building a neighborhood where people felt supported. This new approach led to an unexpected but incredibly positive side effect. Neighbors started talking to each other more. The walls that had once kept people apart came down, and we began to create a real sense of community. The transformation wasn't just physical, though. It was emotional, too. People who had been living in fear under Karen's reign began to speak out, sharing their experiences and their ideas. Everyone felt like they had a voice, and together, we made decisions that benefited us all. The changes didn't stop at the HOA level. The community began to rebuild itself in more tangible ways. The neighborhood park, once a neglected patch of land, became a hub of activity. A group of parents came together to redesign the playground, making it more accessible and inclusive for children with disabilities. They even managed to secure a grant to install a community garden where residents could grow their own vegetables and herbs. I couldn't help but smile as I walked through the park one evening, watching families gather, laughing and playing, the sounds of children's voices filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had once dominated the neighborhood, where everyone was too scared to even make eye contact with each other. Now, there was a spirit of camaraderie that I hadn't realized we were missing. As the months passed, my role in the community continued to evolve. I didn't just sit back and enjoy the victory. I actively worked to ensure that the changes we'd made would be sustainable. I partnered with local organizations to provide resources and programs for residents, especially for those who had been hit hardest by Karen's reign. We set up workshops on home maintenance, financial planning, and even legal rights for homeowners, ensuring that everyone had the tools they needed to succeed. It wasn't just about creating a neighborhood that was functional. It was about empowering every person in it to thrive. Despite all the progress, Karen's shadow still loomed large. News of her downfall spread quickly, and while I thought her story would fade, it became a rallying cry for people all over the country who were dealing with the same kind of HOA tyranny. People started reaching out to me, sharing their stories, and asking for advice on how to take back their neighborhoods. It seemed like I had unwittingly become a symbol of resistance against HOA corruption, but I didn't mind. If my experience could help others fight back and reclaim their communities, then it was worth it. In the midst of all the changes, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood, once divided and fearful, had now become an example of what happens when people stand up to injustice. As I walked down the street, watching kids playing and neighbors chatting, I realized that Karen's reign had done more than just drive me to take action. It had united us all. We had fought for something bigger than ourselves, and we had won. In the end, it wasn't just about kicking Karen out of the HOA. It was about rebuilding something better, something that would stand the test of time. We had taken control of our own destiny, and the sense of pride I felt in that moment was indescribable. It wasn't just about the house or the land. It was about the people who lived here and how we had turned a place of fear into a place of hope. The final blow to Karen came when we learned that the other HOA boards in the area had begun to model their new policies after ours. The change had rippled through the community, inspiring other neighborhoods to challenge their own corrupt boards and stand up for what was right. As the press started covering the story of how one neighborhood had taken on the HOA system and won, it felt like the message was spreading far beyond our block. Karen's reign had been defeated, not just because of me, but because the community had stood together. We had shown the world that no matter how powerful an individual might seem, when the people unite, they can topple even the most entrenched systems of control. Now, years later, our neighborhood is thriving. Karen's old house was sold, and the new family that moved in couldn't be more different from her. They're kind, considerate, and most importantly, they're part of the community. There are no more HOA violations, no more threats, just a group of neighbors working together to build a better place to live. As I sit on my porch, watching the sun set over the street, I know that we've created something that will last. We didn't just kick Karen out. We kicked out the old ways of thinking, the fear, and the control. We've built a place where everyone belongs and no one is left behind. And in the end, that's the greatest victory of all.